core values survey. And lecture will be on Turkey, Islam, and Europe.
Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren. Your Excellency, you started out with a quotation from an American president, so let me continue in that tradition. Heute, ich bin ein Berliner. Heute, wir sind alles Berliner von der Universität Bahçeşehir. They can't hear me? The mic is like my wife, it doesn't let me speak. The topic of my now I'll have to switch to English. The topic of my first lecture is going to be Europe, Islam, and Turkey. And do I need to say anything about the relevance today of that topic? It is really a burning issue. The very recent events have indeed shown that to all of us. But especially since the horrific terrorist events of 9/11, which continued in Madrid and London and Istanbul as well, and in other places, the issue has been, especially for Europe, for the Islamic world, and for the whole world, in fact. 20 years ago, no foundation would be willing to support research that would propose, let's say, a survey of Islamic publics. Today, both in the European Union and in North America, national science institutions, foundations, are all competing and racing to support research, to give research grants to those working in this field. Of course, 9/11 was a dramatic turning point, but less dramatically in Europe. Of course, negotiations with Turkey for full membership in the EU has started, and that has also opened a new chapter. But let me warn you, I'm an academic. Therefore, my talk is not going to be diplomatic. We academics are not known for our diplomatic talents. To the contrary, we are known for our bluntness. And therefore, some of the comments and quotations may irritate, may disturb some of our listeners. I do apologize, but I do intend to speak not diplomatically, but frankly. Now, even if we disregard Turkish membership, I guess that would be a realistic assumption for the time being. Nevertheless, the number of Muslims in Europe has grown from 29.6 million in 1990 to 44.1 million in 2010. In a couple of years, it will reach 50 million. And the projections for 2030 are 58 million Muslims in Europe. Now that figure includes non-EU countries, includes Russia, etc. But what's the situation within the EU? The Pew Center in the United States estimates that for 27 EU countries in 2010, there are close to 20 million, over 19 million Muslims. Islam is now the second largest denomination with a population proportion of around 5%. and it is expected to reach 8% or so in the coming 2 decades. So what, we might ask? As non-believers live together in Europe. So what's so special about having 5 or 6 or 7% Muslims within that population? The Atlas of European Values has put it rather mildly. They wrote, the integration of Muslims in Western Europe and the role of Islam on the continent is a much debated issue in politics and society. A considerable number of people consider the growing number of Muslims as a severe threat to national culture and habits. In France and Belgium, for example, laws have been adopted which prohibit wearing headscarves, the hijab and the burqa. Switzerland imposed a law against the construction of minarets, and in the Netherlands and Denmark, political parties with an anti-Islam program won a considerable number of votes during recent elections. End of quotations from the Atlas of European Values published by Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Many have expressed the issue more forcefully, more aggressively, more bluntly. Just one example. Philippe de Winter, leader of the Vlaams Belang Party in Belgium, said, Islamization is Europe's biggest problem right now. If we don't do something fast, it will be too late. We have asked, what's so special? Why is this religion a threat? Now, we might approach the question from a historical point of view, which is not my main concern today, or from a contemporary values perspective, which I will try to talk about briefly. Historically, of course, Turkish conversion to Islam started around mid-7th century or so, and it continued for about 3 centuries. Now, pre-Islam relations between Europe and the Turks were not exactly amicable. Barbaric warriors destroying all civilization was the image of the Turks, obviously. And quite clearly, religious rivalry did not contribute to improve the relations and perceptions. On the contrary, we witness on both sides sort of animosity that exceeded rivalry. Here's an excerpt from Pope Urban II, dating back to the 11th century. Everywhere, I quote, everywhere in those cities, he's talking about what is now southern Turkey, Antioch, etc. There is sorrow. Everywhere there is misery. Everywhere groaning, and I say it with a sigh. The churches in which divine mysteries were celebrated in olden times are now, to our sorrow, used as stables for the animals of these people. Holy men do not possess those cities, nay, base and bastard Turks hold sway over our brothers. Then follow centuries of conquests by the Ottoman Turks. The unsuccessful Vienna sieges are still in the collective memories of Europeans. For instance, Fritz Bolkenstein, the Dutch single market commissioner at the time, declared that Turkish entry into the EU would mean that 1683, when Turkish troops were thrown back from the gates of Vienna, would have been invaded. 1683. Go back 4 centuries, more than 4 centuries, it's still in the memories. And Valéry Giscard d'Estaing expressed the sentiment, in words of equal strength. He said, Turkish entry would be the end of Europe, period. If you're interested, the quotation was from The Economist, September 18, 2004. And here are some quotations from a cardinal. In the course of history, Turkey has always represented the opposite continent, in permanent contrast to Europe. Making two continents identical would be a mistake. Turkey could try to set up a cultural continent with neighboring Arab countries and become the leading figure of a culture with its own identity. It would be a great mistake to accept a Muslim state into Europe. Turkey is the antithesis of Europe. Would you like to know the name of this cardinal? Ratzinger. So, the papal tradition is still well and alive, it seems like. Keeping with the historical perspective, we have to admit that the feelings were mutual. One would not be hard-pressed to find equally strong statements on the Muslim side of the fence. Muslims believed that they represented the superior civilization, not the infidels of Europe, obviously. From a Muslim perspective, the world was divided into two. Darul Islam, the land of Islam, and Darul Harb, the land of war. War about what? I think we all know. To conclude this brief historical excursion, I offer a quotation from Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister and also the Foreign Minister of Sweden. He said, throughout the Middle Ages, for Europe, the other was Turkey. In other words, Europe was defined with reference to Muslim Turks. Cultural factors surely play a role. In fact, he said that to me once in person. He said, it is really culture, more than anything else. But the former Dutch Prime Minister Balkenende said, and I fully agree, he said, raising barriers to any particular religion does not fit in with Europe's shared values. Now, I think that is the quotation that should be taken into account. But now, we are at the point of asking a critical question. Sorry? The microphone. You can hear me back there, can't you? They all hear me quite well, no problem. Okay. The critical question is, does Europe really have shared values? They all talk about European values. What are these European values? Well, usually it is said that there are 4 pillars of European civilization. What are those? Well, the ancient Greek thought, obviously, ancient Greek philosophy, Roman thought, the Christian or Judeo-Christian traditions. So all the philosophy is covered, religion is covered, law is covered. There, fine. And then some might add a 4th pillar to that, enlightenment. Which, to me personally, would be the most significant and important of all these 4 pillars. Nevertheless, what are these common values? I'm a humble student of values. And I look at European values, world values, Turkish values, etc. By values, of course, I mean what people think about what is wrong, what is right, what should be done, what should not be done. The rhetoric of shared European values is common. In Jose Manuel Barroso's words, common values are at the heart of our relations. But I don't hesitate to make the concluding statement right at the beginning, right now. There is such great variation among European societies that one has to really stretch one's imagination to speak of a common value system. This is true for even the so-called core values. What are these core values? What are some of the candidates? Religious values, democratic values, multiculturalism, tolerance, gender equality, women's role in society and politics, sexual liberation, work values, the list can go on and on. I have only time for a couple of examples. Let's start with religion. Belonging to a religion, any religion. 98% of Romanians and 98% of Greeks, almost everybody in Romania and Greece, say they belong to a religion. The proportion is 31% in the Czech Republic. 98 versus 31, less than 1/3. Common religious values, or being a religious person. 93% in Cyprus, for example, southern Cyprus, state that they personally consider themselves to be a religious person, and only 34% of the Czechs consider themselves religious in any shape or form. Believing in God, 98% in Romania, 48% in Sweden, etc. Those who go to church at least once a month, 3/4 of the Poles, the Polish citizens. Almost the same proportion of the Irish go to church. In Sweden, the proportion is 10%. In Estonia, it is 9%. Clearly, a member of the European Union. Okay? And gender equality, men should have priority for jobs over women. In many EU countries, the proportions are close to 50%, 40%. If there's unemployment is a problem, men should have priority. Then in Denmark, only 2%. Almost nobody believes in that. Again, there's a big range. The point is clear. The answer to the first question is obvious. Let us now try to tackle what we might call the Islam problem in Europe. I have already made detailed references to the Muslim population in Europe. And as if that were not enough, a country with a population of almost 75 million is negotiating to join the EU. Now, many have come after 9/11 to equate Islam with terrorism. In fact, Islamic terrorism has become a household term. Treatment and position of women in Islamic societies is of great concern. The same is true for different sexual orientations. Compatibility of Islam with free and fair elections and democracy is being questioned everywhere. Can Islamic societies secularize? Can individuals in Islamic societies secularize? And more importantly, can governments in those societies secularize? Is another crucial question. Now, one has to admit that these are not unfair, unfounded questions based solely on prejudice. Of course, getting rid of prejudices, getting rid of the historical baggage, for lack of a better term, is important. And we should all strive to get rid of those. But of course, we also have to address the reality as it is. We do not wish to circumvent reality. It is only if we accept the real situation that we can begin to solve these important problems that bother all of us Democrats in every country. Few facts. The World Economic Forum ranks countries with respect to gender gap. Of the lowest ranking 10 countries, 7 are Muslim majority countries. And of the lowest 15, no less than 12 are Muslim majority countries. The exceptions are Ivory Coast, which is 37% Muslim, Benin, which is 25% Muslim, and Nepal. There's only one predominantly Islamic country where the government has been changing hands through elections for any appreciable length of time. And you know the country that one is. Only one example. Islamic countries consistently rank among the worst in Freedom House ratings of democracy and freedoms. Secular government is still unthinkable in many of those societies. So, returning to our question again, are these generalizations about Islam true for European Muslims as well? In other words, are Europe's Muslims carriers of same or similar values that bear these consequences, some of which I have mentioned a minute ago? Is, well, Turkey being the only predominantly Muslim country in Europe, is Turkey an outlier with respect to values? I'm not going to say common European values anymore because I think I've already demonstrated that there is no such thing. But nevertheless, within the given range, are we outliers? With respect to the data produced by the European Values Studies program, quite frankly, Romania or Bulgaria, for instance, are as much outliers as Turkey, both being EU members. Nevertheless, with respect to religiosity, levels of religiosity, with respect to democratic values, for example, tolerance, with respect to gender equality, and with respect to human sexuality, there are problems. There are sometimes serious problems there. Then we might ask the following question. What are the prospects for change? That, of course, is a theoretical question. They'll warn me again. I cannot walk around. The theoretical question is, how does culture change? How do cultural values change? Do they, or are they immutable? Well, the answer first is cultural values change slowly. They don't change overnight. Nobody should expect cultures to transform themselves into something else in very short periods of time. But, short of wars, short of other catastrophic events, crises, etc., of course that's one mechanism for change. All these traumatic events that happen in the lives of societies, wars, economic crises, famines, epidemics, etc. There are basically two major mechanisms for cultural change. One is generational replacement, and the second, and that brings me to our final topic now, is education. Generational replacement is something that I need not say much about. New generations might, they don't always do, they might bring in new values. Okay, so when younger generations replace the older ones, there is some room for cultural value change. But in the Turkish case, it seems like education is a much more important mechanism for value change. I wanted to show you some slides about that, but it seems like we're going to have technical problems there. So I will, with your kind permission, and I promise this will be the final ones, I will read some figures about the role of education in Turkey. As part of the World Values Surveys, people were asked, do you think people who do not believe in God should be allowed to become politicians, to rule their countries? Okay? 68% of the of Turks with an elementary education or less, no education or elementary school education, agreed that that should be the case, that politicians should be God figures. Okay? Well, 68%. Then I'm going through the figures for junior high, high school, and university. 56, 43, 37%. It's cut by almost half as the level of education goes up. 37% is exactly the same as the proportion in Greece. In fact, 52% of the Romanians agree with that statement. Yes, more than half. It is better if people with strong religious beliefs hold office. 60% of elementary school graduates or less. 29% of university graduates. Less than half. Again, I can compare this with a number of EU countries, but as I have said, it's boring to listen to these figures continuously, so I will spare you the agony of listening to those figures. But would you want an atheist as your neighbor? Is that acceptable to you? Elementary school or less education, 77% in Turkey say, no, I wouldn't want such a neighbor. And 38% of university graduates. How about a person of a different religion? 15% of university graduates. And if I could show you the figures, it's quite linear. I mean, as the level of education increases, tolerance also increases dramatically. Men have more right to a job. If there's unemployment, if jobs are scarce, well, 65% of elementary school graduates in Turkey, 34% of university graduates. 85% of elementary school graduates, women that is, cover their hair for religious reasons in Turkey. 85%. Among university graduates, the proportion is 80%. Education changes values. And we're in the business, luckily, of education. So, to sum up, Islam in Europe is an important, if not urgent, topic, both from an academic and a policy point of view. When we ask if Islamic values are compatible with European values, we first note that there is great variation in values within Europe. Nevertheless, there is deep concern about the observed relationship between Islam and democracy, secular system of government, treatment of women, etc. As noted, many of these are legitimate concerns, many are supported by data. The crucial question was, can these values change? Or are they unchangeable core values? One can, and many people do, argue on both sides. But I think, very briefly, I have no time to elaborate on that. In fact, I think your patience is wearing out thin, so I am going to stop now. Have I exceeded the time? I have. Wow, that is a first. That is a first. Nevertheless, I'm not going to, as I have said, try your patience anymore, and I'm going to finish here. But I think Turkey can help us answer this crucial question by looking in more detail at the role of education and the data provided by various analyses which bring together education on the one hand and values on the other. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Esmer, for this very interesting first lecture of